This is Brian M. Gardner, and I'm going to share with you the presentation that I gave to Urban Affairs Association in 2002. This is going to be rough because I have a backlog of ideas that I want to get out into the world, and I'll be releasing cleaned up versions in the future. But for now, let's talk about how game theory can revolutionize urban planning, just like it has so many other fields. And it can do so without even resorting to complicated math. What is game theory? Well, it comes from economics, but its impacts and implications have been felt in a vast array of other disciplines. I first learned about game theory in pursuit of my MBA, where I fell in love with coopetition. Basically, game theory is the set of methods and methodologies for predicting outcomes when more than one person or player is trying to make a decision, and that decision will impact or be impacted by other players who are also making decisions. This seemingly benign concept has gone so far as to show such diverse things as why peacocks have cumbersome plumage and why the US political system is incapable of supporting a three-party system. The basic way to understand game theory is to break down the different parts of a game. Parts stands for players, added values, rules, tactics, and scope. One of the basic components of the game is players. Those are the people playing the game. I talked about them before. In Prisoner's Dilemma, perhaps one of the most famous examples of game theory, two prisoners are deciding whether to cooperate with the police and inform on the other one. Things don't end well in that game most of the time. But adding a mafia boss as the third player waiting to exact vengeance on a tattletale can drastically change the outcome. Each player in a game has an added value. It's the amount of value that they bring to that game. The impact that the players have is determined by their added value. When an individual employee is going up against a company negotiating for their salary, they might not be able to have much control. However, if they join a union, workers can collectively increase their added value in negotiations with the owners of capital. Another component of a game is the rules. Like in a board game or any other game that you might imagine, these define what players can and can't do, what sort of actions they have available. By changing the rules, no new actions are allowed or prescribed. San Francisco, for example, now requires that new developments include low income housing. This changed the rules and is directly apropos to a case study that we'll go over in a minute. Yet another part of a game are tactics. This is how a player plays or perceives the game. It can include playing offensively versus playing defensively. It can be as simple as forming an alliance. In Risk, players frequently join alliances to take down more dominant players. However, those alliances are rarely forged in stone. Betrayal can be common, and in the United States with World War II, when we made the fateful decision to drop a bomb on Japan, we changed our tactics rather drastically, and that changed the outcome of the war, a game of its own sort, although a very deadly. Finally, we come to scope. That's the size of the game, including the number of players that are playing it, the geographic territory, the stakes of the game, or even the time of the game. A two-parent family might add children to household decisions in order to break a tie, or take turns exchanging making dinner and washing dishes, thus expending the time frame. And so, we have not just reviewed the parts of a game, but also how they might change. I do that because game theory by itself is a very static curriculum. However, when taken into account that you can change the game, that is where the true value adds come from. This brings us nominally to a brief literature review. But as we go through this section, I want you to think of it more of a statement of purpose. In my mind, as I put it forward, game theory exists between a world of positivism and post positivism. It can be highly mathematical, but when applied to urban studies, I suggest that it shouldn't. Math has a tendency to hide harms, and people who exist on the margins are too easy to discount as outliers. Further, I do not think it can be assumed that current outcomes in the world of planning are the result of purely strategic thinking. Too much influence is levied by the forces of politics and capital. Even the most kind-hearted and pure planner is forced to bend to the weight of their will, and how things are done is too easy to trump how things should be. This is where I think the realm of game theory can find a place in urban planning, to lay bare not just the cause of what ails our society, but also why it is happening. Armed with this knowledge, a planner can build a path towards a better outcome. That is why I'm focusing this presentation not just on how to design a game, but also how to change it. Urban studies is slowly starting to use game theory concepts, but hasn't gone so far as to include the structures to do so with the most impact. Studies into power dynamics at play in urban cities highlight that actions taken by one party reverberate for generations, and that in systems of historic systemic harm, it is necessary for people in positions of power to show good faith up front if more positive outcomes are to be achieved in the future. So, how can game theory be used as a method? Well, there are three different ways according to the validity of games, simulation, and gaming. The first is mathematical. In this, different equations are run and payoffs are calculated based on the results. Physical games can be produced as experiments or as simulations. Finally, we come to what I think is the most impactful implementation for urban studies: conceptual games. Here, decision trees are mapped out. Sometimes these trees can expand over multiple timeframes or turns. Players' future actions can be impacted by their earlier choices, as well as the choices of other players. Indeed, in our upcoming case study, we will be using a conceptual analysis of what I will dub the gentrification. And so now, without further ado, a case study: the rent gap versus the gentrification game. To recap, for those of you who don't know, or know and have forgotten, Neil Smith first proposed the rent gap theory in 1979. He wisely observed the return to the city movement in the US as a case of the tail wagging the dog. It was not that people were interested in coming back to the city, as much as that they were interested in inhabiting the pretty new buildings that were being built. Over time, he proved the actual rent that a dilapidated building could collect diminished, but the potential rent of a refurbished, shiny new building did not. And so developers were incentivized, he concluded, to build new buildings so that they could better capture their potential rent and obtain a greater profit. And so people thought that was a good enough explanation of gentrification for decades, but only because they never did a game theoretical analysis. Let's see what the gentrification game has to say, and through it, uncover the benefit that game theory can bring to urban studies. First, we're going to start with one simple abstraction. At any given point in time, the housing market is either going to be falling or rising. Let's look back at the process of developing a conceptual model for a game. We are on the left at designing the game as an abstraction of reality. The game, as you may recall, has parts. The P for parts stands for players. Our game has 7 players: poor renters, rich renters, homeowners, landlords, developers, investors, and the government. Each of these players has their own added value. I've approximated the added value of these 7 players from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. Poor renters, unfortunately, don't bring a lot to the game, and they don't have a lot of control over it because of it. Rich renters have money, and they are, after all, the people that developers unfortunately develop for. Homeowners mostly set this out, sitting contently in their own homes. They may at some point become landlords, at which point in time they will help set the price of rent for the renters. Developers, well, develop. That's what they do. But in order to develop, they're going to need some funding from investors. The investors hold almost all of the power, except there's also the government. The government does something pretty interesting. They make the rules. We're going to skip the rules for now and go directly to T for tactic. Poor renters' primary tactic is to do what they can to stay housed. If they become unhoused, they exit the gentrification game having lost. That impact is not trivial. Shelter is one of Maslow's basic needs for a reason. Rich renters, in contrast, aim to maximize quality of life. They will move in pursuit of that ephemeral objective with minimal concern. Homeowners, meanwhile, have exited the renting section of the game and seek to obtain and maintain an habitable investment. It is worth noting that because of redlining and structurally racist policies, not everyone in America was able to be a homeowner historically. Landlords have gone one step further up the food chain from homeowners. They have enough land not just to satisfy their basic need for shelter or an investment that they can inhabit. They have moved so far up the rent food chain that they are in a place of being able to rent for other players. Even landlords pale in comparison to the might of developers. Their main tactic is to build new projects or renovate old ones, and then sell these projects for a profit. They are often funded by investors, whose primary tactic is to mitigate risk while earning the largest possible return. And that leaves us with government. As an entity, we can be magnanimous and assume that they are out for the public good. City planners may even have that as their main priority. But politicians are also part of the government, and their tactic is to curry favor with investors and developers to fund their reelection campaigns, while also at least placating the general populace. The final letter of parts is scope. For this abstraction, I'm putting the scope at the neighborhood level. It's for reasons that would be familiar to Goldilocks. Anything larger would be too large. Anything smaller would be too small. And so, for this particular abstraction, we are looking at a neighborhood within a city, or in its suburbs, or in the country. Here we are, stuck with the rules. What is it about these pesky rules? And why haven't I mentioned them yet? Well, for one thing, they don't seem to matter. Every city and municipality in the US has different rules, and yet gentrification continues to run rampant. San Francisco even mandated that new developments include low income housing, and still, there's the missing middle, looming large. So, for right now, let's assume that the rules don't matter. We live in a capitalist society after all, and land is one of the most basic forms of capital. And here we are, at our first decision tree. This decision tree belongs to poor renters. When the market falls, they are unlikely to move. They are more likely to stay. It's not that likely that the market's going to fall so far that it will be worth uprooting their lives and the family, paying for the moving costs, etc., to relocate. The poor are unlikely to take on the expense of moving. However, if the market rises, they'll stay as long as they can, again, to avoid the cost and impact to their lives of moving. But eventually, they might have to. If the market rises so much, they might be priced out and forced to leave. Rich renters, on the other hand, are likely to leave if the market falls. Likely, they might see that there's a decreasing quality of life. They might find themselves feeling less safe. If it rises, they're likely to stay because status quo plus potentially better quality of life on the rise. They also might move in search of an even better quality of life someplace else. Homeowners are likely to stay when the market falls and maybe move if it rises because they could become landlords, use the property that they used to inhabit to rent to other people and live someplace else instead. If the market falls, landlords are likely to maintain their ownership of a property. as long as their net operating income is positive. If their net operating income goes negative, they might try to recoup their losses by selling. If the market rises, their operating income will rise, and they might decide to sell in search of an exit from the market. Developers are going to buy when the market falls and sell in order to cut their losses if they have to. If the market is rising, then they're likely to buy as long as there's some room for improvement on the structure that's on the land. If it rises too high, they're likely to sell in order to get an easy profit. Investors are unlikely to come into a market where the market is falling. The risk is just too high. However, they are likely to come into a rising market because it's got a higher payout and a lower risk. Finally, we come to government. I've dropped some breadcrumbs throughout this presentation, and some of you might already realize things are about to change here. The reason is because most of the time there's a hole in Neil Smith's rent gap analysis. Developers can't just swoop in and build in a dilapidated or blighted area of town, the blighted's in air quotes, because often investors won't lend to them. Investors were left out of his analysis. Government was left out too. And this is why we said the rules don't matter, because government has the power to change the rules. More than just that, they can change the scope and even the illusory game board. They do this by investing or incentivizing redevelopment. These investments change the game, and redevelopment initiatives change the rules. Both things signal to investors that it's safe to lend money for new developments in the area, and this changes the state of the game on a neighborhood level. And the market that is falling turns into a market that is rising. Government will do this to fix a blighted or impoverished neighborhood or to install some needed resource or a park. But the neighborhood's benefit doesn't benefit the people who live there. They get pushed out. Even homeowners eventually feel the need to leave as the neighborhood just isn't what it once was, or they get priced out. The displacement and relocation of the poor is the harm that comes from gentrification. So what I'm proposing is that government includes policies that benefit the displaced and help keep communities together. They're changing the rules anyway. Why not help people too, and not just developers? Also, to conclude the slide, eventually the market will rise high enough that the government will back out and stop its investments in a neighborhood. This will cause the market to fall again. Here we are, up at the top of the model. Having developed the game and seen that it has some relevance to reality, we move on to the next step, attempting to test to see if the game actually does match what is observed in reality. Let's test our model by seeing if it matches up with reality. If the gentrification game is right, then government will step in, signaling investors, incentivizing developers. They will, in effect, change the rules. This happened in San Francisco when the mayor gave Twitter large tax breaks to occupy a decrepit and long abandoned property on Ninth and Market. It also happened in Boston's Quincy Market over 200 years after it was first built. This project was touted as a giant triumph of city planning in Garvin's coffee table paperweight, The Planning Game. It was also called out by name as an example of displacement and neighborhood disruption in Zukin's Loft Living. Likewise, Garvin sings the praises of Harbor Place in Baltimore. But Harbor Place was also called out by name in Loft Living in 1972. That's great, I hear you saying. You've told me some good things. What are we going to do about it all? Well, I told you game theory had some solutions. Let's see what it might prescribe in this particular instance. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you the Zero Displacement Policy Proposal. Part 1. Create a moving fund. This is to offset the inordinate cost of moving that primarily impacts the poor renters who are displaced when redevelopment happens in an urban center or in a rural area. Instead of tying rent control to a property that, let's face it, is about to be torn down and replaced by another one, let's create portable rent control. How would we do that? Easy. Identify the mean rent paid in a redevelopment zone and tell the builders that they need to include units in their new building to house displaced tenants at that price. Sure, some might pay a little more, others might pay a little less, but it should mostly come out in the wash on average. And government can even guarantee a minimum as long as they're being paid back from any overages. Part 3 of the Zero Displacement Plan, cash payments. These would be paid to the lowest income renters in the redevelopment zone. They would be covered by the increase in property tax based on the new property value of the redeveloped area. So here we are at the conclusion. Although I would put forward that this is really just the beginning. By using game theory to analyze the urban imaginary, we can create models that approximate reality and use those models to test hypotheses and maximize societal outcomes. As part of my thesis, I taught a whole seminar on how game theory can be applied to urban studies. Would you like to know more? If so, let's talk in the comments below. More big thoughts are coming. Please like and subscribe.